It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to settle into a peaceful rhythm. The sky was painted in deep shades of purple and orange, as the sun dipped low behind the horizon. The woman drove along the empty streets, her car humming softly on the smooth road. It had been a long day, and all she wanted was to get home and relax. Little did she know, this simple drive would change everything. She was no stranger to long days. As a leader of an elite task force, her work was demanding, often involving high-pressure situations and dealing with dangerous criminals. She had earned her place in that position through sheer skill and determination, but it hadn't come without its struggles. Despite her professional success, she still faced prejudice and bias because of her race and gender. People often saw her as a mere statistic rather than the capable, fierce individual she truly was. She had grown used to it over the years. She had to be better, faster, and more efficient than anyone else just to prove she belonged. That evening, as she drove through the quiet streets, her mind was focused on nothing but the need to unwind. She glanced at the clock, almost 8 p.m. She was almost home, the comfort of her bed just a few minutes away. But then suddenly the familiar sound of a siren pierced the air. Her heart skipped a beat. She instinctively slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She had been pulled over before, but it was always a moment of uncertainty. She knew what it felt like to be judged by the color of her skin, especially when dealing with law enforcement. The officer's vehicle stopped behind hers, its headlights casting a harsh glow against the night. The woman took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. She didn't want to make the situation worse, so she did as she was taught. She rolled down her window slowly and waited. The officer stepped out of his car. He was tall, his uniform neatly pressed, but there was a certain stiffness in his gait, as if he already had an attitude before even approaching her vehicle. He didn't bother greeting her or asking if she was okay. Instead, he began speaking in a condescending tone, his words sharp and accusing. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The woman kept her gaze straight ahead, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror, making sure she had everything ready. Her hands were still on the steering wheel, a calm facade hiding the simmering tension she felt inside. She knew better than to escalate things, but she was tired, so tired of these encounters. She had enough of being judged. "I'm not sure, officer," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He eyed her suspiciously, scanning her face as though she were hiding something. "You were speeding. I clocked you going 10 miles over the limit." The woman raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at her speedometer. "That's not possible. I've been maintaining the speed limit." He didn't seem to care about her explanation. Instead, he took a step closer to her car, leaning in a little too close. His breath smelled of cheap coffee and stale cigarettes. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice cold. "I don't have time for games." She stayed calm, keeping her response measured. "I'm not lying, officer. I'm sure there's been some mistake." Without another word, he stepped back and stared at her for a moment, sizing her up. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of disdain that made her uncomfortable. It was the kind of look she had seen countless times before, a look that said she didn't belong, that she was an outsider. It was a look she had learned to ignore over the years, but it still stung each time. The officer, still not satisfied with her response, took a step back and began writing something in his ticket book. She could hear the scratch of the pen on paper, and for a moment everything felt suspended in time. The silence between them felt heavy, suffocating. She wanted to speak up again, to argue that this wasn't right, but she knew that could lead to more trouble. She had been here before. She had been pulled over countless times by officers who didn't see her as a professional, who didn't see her as a leader. They only saw her as another black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then, without warning, the officer snapped his ticket book shut and suddenly reached for the back of his belt. He didn't say anything, but his movement was aggressive. It was like something inside him snapped. "I don't appreciate you lying to me," he said, his voice suddenly louder. "Step out of the car." Her pulse quickened, her body stiffened. This was not a typical traffic stop. This was something else. She had dealt with enough of these moments to recognize the signs. The officer was trying to provoke her, trying to make her angry. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She remained calm, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not stepping out of the car," she replied, her voice firm but controlled. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the anger bubbling under the surface, but she knew she had to stay composed. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Don't make me drag you out of there," he growled. taking another step toward the car. At that moment, something in the back of her mind clicked. It was as if everything around her slowed down. She could feel the tension in her muscles, the fight or flight instinct urging her to leave, to flee the scene. But she didn't, she couldn't. Instead, she opened the door slowly, stepping out in a smooth motion. She kept her hands visible, her posture relaxed, making it clear she wasn't a threat. But the officer didn't seem to care. He was already seething with anger, looking for any reason to escalate things. "You think you can just lie and get away with it?" he spat. She stood tall, looking him directly in the eye. "I'm not lying, officer," she repeated, her voice steady. "And I don't appreciate the way you're speaking to me." The officer's jaw clenched. Without warning, he raised his baton and smashed it against the front of her car. The loud crack echoed in the quiet night air. The sound of metal hitting metal felt like a slap to her face. Her car's headlight shattered, the pieces of glass falling to the ground in a sharp, glittering shower. For a moment, she just stared at the damage. She couldn't believe it. It was like something out of a nightmare. A small part of her wanted to scream, to let out all the frustration she had kept inside for so long, but she didn't. She simply stood there, taking it all in, her eyes locked on the officer. The officer stepped back, looking at her with a smug expression, as if he had just won some kind of battle. But she didn't flinch. She didn't react the way he expected her to. Instead, she reached for her phone, taking a mental note of his badge number as she prepared to file a report. "I'll be reporting this," she said quietly, her voice low but full of conviction. The officer sneered. "Go ahead," he spat. "You think anyone will believe you?" But she didn't care what he thought. She knew exactly who she was, and that was more than enough. As the officer walked away, she stood there for a moment, the broken headlight glinting in the dim light of the street lamps. The silence returned, but it felt different now. The world had shifted, and she knew that this moment, this encounter, would lead her down a path that would change everything. As the woman drove away from the scene, the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her hands were still trembling on the steering wheel, but she fought to keep her composure. It wasn't the first time she'd been mistreated by someone in authority, but it was different this time. The officer's blatant aggression, the way he had smashed her car's headlight, felt like an attack not just on her but on everything she had worked so hard to build. The streets ahead were familiar, the route she'd taken 100 times before. But tonight everything felt different. The quiet hum of the car's engine, which had once been soothing, now felt like a constant reminder of the injustice she had just endured. The officer's sneer echoed in her mind, and the broken glass from the headlight seemed to flash in front of her eyes at every turn. She knew she had to do something about it. Ignoring it would only allow him to think he could get away with it, but confronting him head-on could make everything more complicated. As a leader of an elite task force, she understood the delicate balance between standing up for herself and maintaining professionalism. The truth was, it wasn't just about her. It was about the system, about the thousands of others who had been treated unfairly and quietly accepted it. Her phone buzzed in her lap, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced down briefly, seeing a message from one of her team members asking about a case they were working on. She sighed and tapped a quick reply, assuring them everything was under control. They didn't need to know about the altercation with the officer. Not yet, there were bigger things at stake. When she finally pulled into her driveway, she felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It had been a long day. She got out of the car, glancing at the damaged headlight once more. It was still hard to believe. She had dealt with her fair share of setbacks, but this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. Inside her home, she threw her bag onto the couch and sank into a chair. She needed to think, to plan her next steps. She had already made up her mind that she wasn't going to let this go. She would file a report against the officer, but it had to be done carefully. She knew that sometimes the system was slow to react, especially when it came to misconduct from those in power. She had seen it happen too many times before. The officer who had pulled her over didn't know who she was. He had no idea that she was the one who had helped solve some of the most high-profile cases in the city. He didn't know that she was the head of a task force that was respected across the department. To him, she was just another black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. To her, that was the problem. He hadn't seen her as a person, just a stereotype, and that had to change. She knew the importance of making sure that things were done the right way. She could have easily let her anger take control, but she refused to let herself be defined by rage. Instead, she took a deep breath and began drafting her complaint. She made sure every detail was accurate, from the officer's behavior to the way he had damaged her car. She wanted to make sure nothing was left out. If this was going to go anywhere, it had to be airtight. As she typed, she reflected on the years of hard work she had put into her career. She had been underestimated by so many people because of her race, because of her gender. She had faced countless barriers, but she had always managed to push through them. But this time it felt different. It wasn't just about breaking through barriers for herself. It was about changing the system for good. The hours passed by in a blur as she wrote and rewrote the report, making sure everything was precise and thorough. By the time she was finished, the sun had set and the house was quiet. She sent the report off to her superior, making sure they knew the seriousness of the situation. It wasn't just about the damage to her car. It was about the officer's behavior and the larger problem of bias that still ran rampant in the department. She sat back, her mind racing. There was no going back now. She had taken the first step and all she could do was wait. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She would not allow herself to be silenced, and she would not let her experience be brushed aside. She had worked too hard for too long to let someone else define her. The next day, the woman arrived at work early as usual. The office was quiet, the air thick with the kind of tension that comes before the storm. She walked past her colleagues, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement. They didn't know about what had happened the night before. To them, she was just the same confident, composed leader they had always known. But deep inside, she was steeling herself for what was to come. Her team was already in the conference room, gathered around the table. The moment she walked in, they fell silent, waiting for her to speak. They respected her, trusted her. They had seen firsthand how dedicated she was to her work, how tirelessly she fought for justice. And in that moment, as she took her seat at the head of the table, she realized that this was why she had to keep going. She glanced at the case files spread out before her, the photographs and reports of the dangerous criminals they were pursuing, but her mind wasn't fully on the task at hand. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the previous night. What had started as a routine traffic stop had turned into something much more significant. The officer's actions had opened a door, one that she was determined to walk through, no matter what. Her team started discussing the case, and she listened carefully, offering insights and strategies when needed. But in the back of her mind, she knew the officer's actions were still weighing on her. She had filed the complaint, but she knew the road ahead would be far from easy. There were powerful people who would want to sweep the issue under the rug, to protect the officer. But she couldn't let that happen. Not this time. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and briefings. She stayed focused, keeping her emotions in check, but inside she was already planning her next move. She would continue leading her team, doing the work that mattered most, but she couldn't forget the bigger picture. This was about changing the system, about holding people accountable for their actions. By the time she left the office, it was dark again. The woman got into her car and started driving, the familiar street stretching out before her. But tonight she felt a sense of resolve that she hadn't felt before. The encounter with the officer had sparked something inside her, a fire that wouldn't easily be extinguished. She wasn't going to let this one moment define her, but she wasn't going to forget it either. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was used to that. She had faced challenges before, and each time she had come out stronger. This time would be no different. She was determined to see this through to the end, and with that thought she drove on, ready for whatever came next. The days that followed the incident with the officer felt like a blur. The woman kept her focus on her work, the rhythm of the office and the cases her team was handling, helping to distract her from the heaviness she felt inside. But at the same time, the knowledge of what had happened and the officer's actions lingered in the back of her mind. Every time she passed her car, she couldn't help but see the broken headlight, a reminder of how quickly things could escalate, how little control she had over what others thought of her. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message as she sat at her desk. It was from her superior, asking if she could meet later that afternoon. She had expected this. She had sent the report about the incident, and now it was time to face the consequences of that decision. She knew it wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but she was ready. When the clock struck 4 p.m., she left her office and made her way down the hallway to the conference room. The woman had worked hard to get to where she was, and she had earned the respect of her colleagues. But she knew that when it came to challenging authority, things could quickly become complicated. She had seen others in her position back down when confronted with powerful figures, but she wasn't like them. She had never been the type to stay quiet when something wasn't right. Her superior was already in the room, a stern expression on his face as he stood by the window. The moment she entered, he turned to face her, gesturing for her to sit. There was an uncomfortable tension in the air, one that she could feel in her bones. "So," he began, his voice measured, "I've read your report. You've made quite the claim about this officer." He paused, studying her face as if trying to gauge her sincerity. "I want to be clear, I'm taking this seriously. But you understand that we have to go through the proper channels. This could cause a lot of trouble." She didn't flinch. She had anticipated this response, the hesitation, the doubt. People often weren't quick to believe complaints like hers, especially when it came to law enforcement. But she had dealt with enough red tape to know how things worked. She knew how to navigate through the system, and she was prepared to do whatever it took. "I understand," she replied calmly, her voice steady. "But that doesn't change the fact that this officer's actions were wrong. What he did to me was unacceptable, and it's not just about me, it's about the bigger picture. It's about the way people like me are treated in this system." Her superior looked away for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the window. He was quiet for a few seconds before finally responding. "You're right. I'm not ignoring the problem. But I need you to understand that this could escalate beyond what we're prepared for. If this goes public, there's going to be backlash. People will ask questions and we'll have to answer for everything." The woman nodded slowly, understanding the reality of the situation. She had expected this reaction and she wasn't surprised. But it didn't change her resolve. She had faced adversity before, and she was used to fighting for what was right even when the odds were stacked against her. "I'm not afraid of the consequences," she said firmly. "What I'm afraid of is allowing this officer to get away with this. I'm afraid of letting him think that this kind of behavior is acceptable. I've worked too hard to let that happen." Her superior met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and concern. "I know how hard you've worked and I admire your dedication. But you're also putting yourself in a dangerous position. You're making waves in a system that doesn't always like change." She didn't back down. "I've never been afraid of making waves. And if change is what's needed, then that's exactly what I'm going to do." The silence between them hung in the air for a moment, both of them considering the weight of her words. Finally, her superior let out a deep sigh and nodded. "All right. We'll take it from here. But you need to be prepared for what comes next. We'll make sure your complaint is heard, but the officer is likely going to deny everything. We'll need evidence, anything that can back up your story." The woman stood, feeling a surge of determination. "I'm ready." As she left the conference room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her superior's words hadn't shaken her. They had only strengthened her resolve. She had already decided that she wasn't going to let this go. She would do whatever it took to make sure that the officer was held accountable for his actions, no matter what the consequences might be. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and interviews. She had to give her statement to internal affairs, which meant recounting the details of the night she had been pulled over, describing the officer's behavior in as much detail as she could remember. It was a difficult process, especially as she had to relive the anger and humiliation she had felt in that moment. But it was necessary. She had to make sure there was no room for doubt. Throughout it all, her team remained unaware of what she was going through. She didn't want to burden them with it, didn't want them to worry. They had their own work to focus on, and she didn't want to distract them from the important cases they were handling. But it was getting harder and harder to keep it all together. One afternoon, as she was going over case files, one of her team members knocked on her door. He entered the office and looked at her with a curious expression. "Hey," he said gently. "You've been a little off lately. Everything okay?" She looked up from her desk, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a lot on my plate." He didn't seem convinced. "You sure? We're all here for you if you need to talk." She appreciated his concern, but she couldn't bring herself to share what was happening. "Not yet." "I'm fine," she said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'll be okay." Her colleague hesitated for a moment, but then he nodded and left, closing the door behind him. The woman let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She was good at hiding her emotions, at keeping up the professional exterior. But inside, the weight of everything was starting to take its toll. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for something much bigger than that. She was fighting for justice, for change, and she couldn't afford to let anything stand in her way. As the investigation into the officer's actions continued, the woman found herself becoming more and more immersed in the process. She was in constant communication with internal affairs, providing any additional information or evidence they requested. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to see it through. The media began to catch wind of the story, and soon, the officer's past began to come to light. More people came forward with similar stories of mistreatment, of officers abusing their power. It was a slow process, but the truth was slowly emerging, piece by piece. The woman couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as the investigation gained momentum. She had started this, and now it was becoming something bigger than just her. It was about creating a ripple effect, about shining a light on the systemic issues that had been ignored for too long. One evening, as she sat in her office going over the latest updates, she received a call from her superior. His voice was serious, but there was a hint of relief in it. "We've got the evidence we need," he said. "The officer has been suspended and the investigation is moving forward." It wasn't over yet, but it was a victory. A small victory perhaps, but a victory nonetheless. And as she hung up the phone, the woman allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She had taken the first step toward change, and now there was no turning back. The news about the officer's suspension spread quickly throughout the department, and with it came a mixture of reactions. Some were supportive, recognizing the need for accountability, while others were less enthusiastic, wondering if this would set a dangerous precedent. But for the woman, the suspension was just the beginning. The battle ahead would be harder, and it wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about the larger system that allowed people like him to act without fear of consequences. As the days passed, the media coverage of the story grew. The initial shock of the officer's suspension wore off, and the public began to focus on the deeper issue: systemic bias within law enforcement. Reports started surfacing about other instances of misconduct, and more individuals came forward with their own stories. The woman's case had sparked a conversation that was long overdue, one that many had been too afraid to start. Despite the growing attention, the woman kept a low profile, preferring to focus on the investigation rather than the media frenzy. She knew that the more attention the story got, the more pressure there would be on everyone involved. But she also knew that the officer's suspension was just one small step. The real challenge lay in making sure that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger shift toward accountability and change. Her team continued to work on their ongoing cases, but she could sense that the tension in the office was building. People were talking. Whispers circulated about the officer's past, about the department's history of overlooking complaints like hers. There was an air of uncertainty, and the woman couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. One afternoon, as she walked down the hallway, one of her colleagues pulled her aside. His expression was serious, and there was a hesitance in his voice as he spoke. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "You've got the attention of the entire department now. This could blow up in ways you're not expecting." She looked him in the eye, her expression steady. "I'm sure. It's not just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Her colleague nodded slowly, but she could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. She didn't blame him. She knew that what she was doing wasn't going to be easy, but she couldn't back down now. She had come too far, and the stakes were too high. That evening, she sat at her desk reviewing the latest updates from internal affairs. The officer who had pulled her over had denied everything, of course. He claimed that he had acted within protocol and that her version of events was exaggerated. His defense was weak, but it didn't matter. It was always going to be a challenge to prove misconduct when it came from someone in a position of power. She had known from the start that this wasn't going to be a quick or easy process, but as she read through the new evidence that had been uncovered, she felt a glimmer of hope. The officer's past was finally catching up with him. Internal Affairs had discovered that this wasn't the first time he had been accused of excessive force or racial bias. Other officers had come forward, some anonymously, others reluctantly, to confirm that the officer had a history of inappropriate behavior. This new information, along with the witness accounts that had begun to surface, was starting to paint a much clearer picture of who he truly was. As the investigation continued to unfold, the woman found herself facing unexpected challenges. People who had once been her allies were beginning to distance themselves from the case, either out of fear or a desire to avoid the growing controversy. She had expected resistance, but it still stung. She had worked alongside many of these people for years, building trust and camaraderie. Yet now, as the case became more public, it was as though they were all suddenly afraid to get involved. One evening, as she was leaving the office, her phone rang. It was her superior. He sounded urgent, his voice laced with concern. "We've got a problem," he said. "There's a leak. Someone's been talking to the press about the investigation." The woman's stomach dropped. She knew what that meant. The investigation was about to become much more complicated. Once the media got involved in a way that wasn't controlled, there was no telling how the situation would escalate. "Who's leaking information?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anxiety creeping up in her chest. "We don't know yet, but we're looking into it. The officer's lawyers are already using the media to build a case for his defense. We're going to have to work quickly to stop this from spiraling out of control." She didn't respond right away. She knew this was coming, the pressure was inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier to handle. She had anticipated a fight, but now the stakes were higher. The department, her team, even the integrity of the investigation were all under scrutiny. The next few days were filled with strategy meetings and damage control. Internal affairs, her superior and legal teams worked together to figure out how to respond to the media attention. The woman knew that she had to stay focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't about the officer anymore. It was about making sure the investigation stayed on track, that the truth came out, and that real change could happen. But despite the chaos around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control. The constant pressure, the leaks, the whispers behind closed doors, it was all starting to wear on her. She had spent so many years building her reputation, and now it felt like it was all being threatened by forces she couldn't control. One morning, as she was walking into the office, she was stopped by one of her team members. He was holding a folder and his expression was grave. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded and followed him into an empty conference room. He handed her the folder, and as she opened it, her eyes narrowed in disbelief. Inside were copies of emails. Emails between several officers within the department discussing the ongoing investigation. They were clearly attempting to discredit her in the case, suggesting that the officer had been provoked during the traffic stop. Some of the emails even mentioned her name, implying that she was making a bigger issue out of the situation than it actually was. The woman's heart raced as she read through the emails. These weren't just whispers. They were coordinated efforts to undermine everything she had worked for. She felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she quickly pushed it down. This was no longer just about one officer. It was about the people within the department who were more concerned with protecting their own than with doing what was right. "I need to take this straight to internal affairs," she said, her voice cold with determination. Her team member nodded, clearly concerned, but he didn't argue. They both knew how serious this was. If the department was actively trying to cover up what had happened, they would have to fight even harder to make sure the truth came out. The woman left the conference room and walked straight to internal affairs. She handed them the folder and explained the situation, the seriousness of what had just been uncovered. Internal affairs promised to investigate the emails, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. People who had been part of her team, people she had trusted, were now working against her. She was not just up against one officer anymore. She was up against a system that was determined to protect its own. But she refused to back down. The more they tried to silence her, the louder she would become. She wasn't going to let the fear and corruption within the days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, late-night calls, and endless paperwork. The woman's determination was unwavering. But even she had to admit that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. The investigation had become a battle, not just between her and the officer who had wronged her, but against an entire system that was pushing back in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. As the internal affairs investigation continued, the woman's role in the department became more and more complicated. Some of her colleagues had begun to distance themselves, others offering support. But there was always that quiet tension in the air. Every conversation felt like a minefield, each decision carrying weight that she hadn't fully understood when she had first filed her complaint. The officer in question, who had once been so confident in his power, now found himself caught in a web of his own making. The information uncovered by internal affairs was damning. The officer had been involved in numerous incidents that had been swept under the rug for years. Complaints of racial bias, excessive force, and misconduct had been ignored by higher-ups in the department. His actions against the woman were not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of behavior that had been tolerated for far too long. The media continued to cover the story, their focus now shifting to the officer's troubled past. The story was no longer just about one woman and one officer. It was about the culture of law enforcement and the systemic issues that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. The department was under a microscope, and with each new revelation, the pressure mounted. But the woman couldn't afford to get lost in the noise. She had come too far to let the media frenzy distract her. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making a point. It was about changing the system, making sure that this kind of injustice wouldn't happen again. She had to see it through for herself and for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by the system. One evening, as she sat at her desk going over the latest updates from the investigation, her phone buzzed with a message from her superior. It was short and to the point. "Meet me in my office tomorrow morning. We need to talk." The message sent a chill through her. She had anticipated this meeting, but that didn't make it any easier. She had seen how the department was reacting to the growing pressure. There were murmurs of moving on and putting it behind us. She knew that if they had their way, the whole thing would be swept under the rug. The next morning, she walked into her superior's office with a sense of purpose. He was already seated at his desk, his expression serious as he looked up at her. "Close the door," he said, his voice low. She did as instructed, taking a seat across from him. The room was quiet, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. "We've reached a point where we need to make a decision," her superior began, his tone measured. "The investigation is moving forward, but there are complications. The department's leadership wants to end this quickly. They want to avoid further embarrassment." The woman's heart raced. She had expected this. She knew the pressure the department was under, but she wasn't willing to let it all be swept aside. "I'm not backing down," she said firmly. "Not now. This is bigger than a single incident. This is about holding people accountable, about making sure this doesn't keep happening." Her superior's eyes flickered with a mixture of admiration and concern. "I know that. But there are people in this department who don't share your view. There are people who would rather protect the officer, protect the department's image than deal with the fallout." The woman took a deep breath. She had heard the same things over and over. She knew the risks. But she also knew that the only way to create change was to push back, to force the conversation no matter how uncomfortable it made everyone. "If I walk away now, nothing changes," she said. "And if we let this go, it sends the message that this is okay. That it's okay to treat people like this, that it's okay to abuse power. I can't be part of that. I won't be." Her superior nodded, but the concern in his eyes didn't fade. "I understand. But be prepared. The backlash is going to be intense. You've already put a target on your back. You've exposed things that people don't want to face." The woman sat up straighter, her voice steady. "I'm ready. I didn't ask for this, but now that it's happened, I'm going to see it through. I'm not going to let fear control me." For a long moment, there was silence between them. Her superior seemed to weigh her words carefully, and then finally he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "All right," he said. "I'll back you. But you need to be prepared for the fallout. You need to be ready for everything that comes next." The conversation ended shortly after that, but the weight of it lingered. The woman knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The department would fight her every step of the way, and they would make sure to make her life difficult. But she couldn't back down. She wouldn't. As the investigation continued, the officer's suspension became permanent. The department announced that he would be dismissed, and a public statement was issued acknowledging the failure to address his previous misconduct. It was a rare victory, one that seemed impossible just months earlier. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The woman's role in the case had shifted. No longer was she just the victim. She had become a symbol of resistance, of the fight for justice in a system that was often unwilling to change. Her name was now known beyond the department, beyond her city. People were starting to listen. But with the growing attention came growing scrutiny. There were those who admired her courage, who praised her for standing up to the system. And then there were those who saw her as a threat, as someone who had rocked the boat and upset the status quo. One evening, as she walked to her car, she felt the familiar sense of unease settle over her. The department had already begun to shift its attention elsewhere, but she knew that the forces working against her hadn't given up. There would be more challenges ahead, more attempts to discredit her, to silence her, but she wasn't afraid. As she drove home that night, she couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. About the officer who had tried to break her, and about the people who had tried to stop her. She thought about the obstacles she had faced, the sacrifices she had made, and the long road that still lay ahead.